I got a little bit of feedback on Doppelganger, and I've been doing some book reviews lately and just kind of going over my highlights. There's one coming up that's based heavily in economics, and I think that if we go through this one first, it's going to help lay the foundation to give us more depth into the economic discussion of another one. But this overall is going to be mainly focused on Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, my personal response, and just thoughts around it. Nothing other than just, hey, want to be part of the conversation. Without further ado, let's get started. You can check the description for a brief overview of what this book is about. I like to just go over my highlights and add any context. On page 4, the introduction, as this project began to truly spiral out of control, I just wanted to highlight that she brings that up. I engaged in all of this neglect so that I could ... What? We have a right, a duty to speak out and share, is what I responded. I think that it's very noble to write a book around what happened and share your point of view to progress the national conversation, the international conversation, the global conversation. Analyze this statement through a lens of manufacturing consent. My deepest shame rests with the unspeakable number of podcasts I mainlined, the sheer volume of hours lost that I will never get back, a master's degree worth of hours. I told myself it was research, that if I was going to understand her and her fellow travelers, who are now in open warfare against objective reality, I had to immerse myself in the archive of several extremely prolific and editing averse weekly and twice weekly shows with names like QAnon Anonymous and Conspirituality that unpack and deconstruct the commingling worlds of conspiracy theorists, wellness hucksters, and their various intersections of COVID-19 denial, anti-vaccine hysteria, and rising fascism. This is on top of keeping up with the daily output from Bannon and Tucker Carlson, on whose shows other Naomi has become a regular guest. And I wrote Selling Fear, and each side is polarized. I underlined an almost wholly hallucinated tyranny that she brings up on the other side of these people. She did say the confusion they sow and oxygen they absorb increasingly stand in the way of pretty much anything helpful or healthful that humans might at some point decide to accomplish together. I underlined that was a little hateful of her to say. Contracted from a classmate whose parents believe that vaccines are part of a plot to commit genocide and enslave humanity because some lady on the internet named Naomi convinced them it was so. You chose to believe it. They weren't on your side, that they're extremists. So I think that was a little bit of like projection on Naomi Klein's part towards Naomi Wolf in a little bit of a way. But I do like the deep dive here that she takes, and I think it's like urgent. I think it's appropriate to take a middle stance, a positioning point, if you will, between the left and the right, which she's so avidly fighting against. So it's like her position from her perspective against the other position from another perspective. And I think it's just up to everybody to kind of speak out about what they saw in order to record the history so that future generations can know the truth. A person who has a doppelganger, Freud wrote, may identify himself with another and so become unsure of his true self. I thought this was insightful to include in the introduction because the doppelganging that she goes through to talk about that happens to all of us is very interesting, especially with the influence of many of the tech giants. Makes a double of a double, an uncanny state of affairs even Freud did not anticipate. I was saying it's like I underlined and then wrote down that next to that, you're confused in the middle like any sane person seeking truth. I don't think it's maybe that intense. I think she's just trying to find a way to explain to herself what's going on. I'm hardly the one to grapple with the sense. Almost everyone I talk to tells me about people they have lost down the rabbit hole. So if it's becoming that bad that almost everybody has gone down the rabbit hole, don't you think it may be time to stop denying that there's a rabbit hole, that there might be a white rabbit worth looking for? I said and starred, why do you think that is? Maybe the truth is easy to see. It's been exposed. Maybe you are the COVID denier in your objective reality. I'm just saying that we see what you're saying from a different perspective as well. And I'm not saying it has to be tied to anything political. I think it can just very well be tied to human nature wanting to explain what's going on in the standpoint that we're at. And I think a lot of that does have to do with how people perceive the world and understand the system that are in place. Anyway, I find the most fascinating psychological aspect of this book being that as somebody who has such a sense of individualism, such as Naomi Klein, and even to the point of writing an entire book about someone else who is just doing their job, that they're doing the same thing in different avenues and is advocating for this, socialism type system, this structure, yet fighting for her own individuality, when she should not have written this book at all if she were to be true. So like it's this reinforcement of Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, that only socialism and communism can exist in a globalization of capitalism, where capitalism is global. This is the only time it can exist, because even these authors, and I think Hayek does a great job of this in his book, explaining that there is a inability to come to terms with the sacrifices that need to be made in order for like a truly socialist totalitarianism system to come into power, because it has to be totalitarian at the end of it, or egalitarian in so many ways, which is what I think is the biggest mirror that I'm seeing now with what authors like Naomi Klein are talking about and Hayek have talked about. People who are alive and dead are basically trying to explain the same thing, and looking at it through a lens of economics gives us a little bit of a more of a perception of it instead of just a political lens, which I think books like this are great. They only tend to focus on the political lens. And so in an effort to set the path for the discussion on trade wars or class wars, we have to get through this one. On page 7 in the introduction, I delve deeply into how post-shock states of discombobulation have been opportunistically exploited in many different contexts. So 9/11 was exploited, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the invasion of Iraq, Hurricane Katrina. Okay, with the public terrified and distracted, power-hungry players were able to move in and ram through policies. Okay, it's isolation and stress to soften up and break prisoners. This is like a tactic that she sees in conservative fascists, but is unwilling to admit might have been also the same tactic used by the Antifa left, the communist fascist, essentially, the communist totalitarians. Of course, you have to define the extremes to come to an agreement. But COVID was different. It scrambled my personal world. It scrambled all of our personal worlds, right? Like everybody either had some insight, everyone had soul searching, it affected everybody, and it didn't affect everybody equally. Absorbed the terror that surrounded us. Okay, so the important part of why I'm underlining what she's saying is she's using very powerful imagery to paint a picture of what some of us didn't see, right? We didn't see overcrowded hospitals. We had I was an essential worker, so I was out and about driving around. I saw the hospitals. I drove by them frequently. There was never terror in the streets. And I lived near a major metropolitan area. There was never this overwhelming bodies in the streets situation. And so this is why looking at it through a lens of manufacturing consent, like Noam Chomsky wrote, is a champion for where anybody needs to take an immediate starting point looking into this. Because if you have seen opportunistically exploited situations committed by major governments across the world, and then now you want to take the antecedent position for what happened globally with COVID, it doesn't quite mesh with somebody who's actually seeking the truth. And so we have to realize that these global powers are using coercive tactics for both sides for personal gain. Whether you're a communist or a fascist, whether you're on the left or the right, we the people of this world, the salt of the earth, who just want to enjoy life, work hard, and have a fulfilling journey throughout, are the ones who are suffering. And so we need to work together. And I think that Naomi Klein does do a really good job of calling into a much needed perspective up to the same tactics that are used by the right, which she so hardly fights against. But I just want to call into that I really respect her. Like, I love Naomi Klein and the books that she's done, from the disaster capitalism, right, in this one, and some of her speeches. I love the perspective that she provides to us. And I think that it's important to take that even further to the grassroots, to the average dudes, to the average family. Right. So it was an unprecedented event for which we do not yet have an adequate explanation. And that's fine. You want to, if that's what you wanted to put in the book. I would say that there's plenty of adequate explanations as to why this happened, whether it be from the other types of warfare, from social warfare to economic warfare to culture warfare. It is quite clear why this happened, because human nature is in many ways unchanged. And even as Hayek puts in his book Road to Serfdom, the worst get to the top, and he lays out why. And so I think we need to just keep stuff like that in mind when we see disaster capitalists and these things that Naomi Klein champions against. We have to keep that in mind, because the worst do get on top. The worst get on top through both avenues, and that's how Hitler got on top, by using the left to get to the fascist right. And so we just have to make sure that we're not going down that same road as we try to progress society. The opportunistic players that have pre-existing wish lists, you're either with us, against us, she lays out the propaganda that they use in order to get people behind that banner. Resist the tin pot tyrants who will tell you that the world is now a blank sheet for them to write their violent stories upon. And then I said, we did resist them. You just didn't like that it was a different tribe that was loudest. Whether there's any merit to that or not is what I wrote and thought at the time as I read that in real time. And then I highlighted further down, when it isn't choked by heat and wildfire smoke or lashed by storms for which we keep having to learn new names, bomb cyclone, atmospheric river, and pineapple express, all in one long wet winter, but it is isolated. So maybe that's what finally pushed me, or is it over the edge? So she goes a little crazy as she's like, so why is this person so much like me but on the opposite side? And I think that's an important thing to call out, because it does give insight, and the ability to self-reflect does show growth. And I think that reading this book is a great challenge to anyone's personal growth and ability to understand kind of what happened. So on page 26, and it wasn't just that one book, I had started writing about the Green New Deal in 2018. She did too, shortly after. Naomi Wolf did, only with her special conspiracy twists. I began publishing about the dangers of geoengineering as a response to the climate crisis, with a particular focus on how high-altitude simulations of volcanoes that were intended to partially dim the sun risk interfering with rainfall in the southern hemisphere. She was busily speculating on social media about chemical cloud seeding and covert mass poisonings. I based my writings on dozens of peer-reviewed papers and managed to get access to 2 closed-door geoengineering conferences, where I interviewed several of the key scientists involved in lab-based research on sending particles into the atmosphere to control the sun's radiations. She started taking photographs of random clouds in upstate New York and London, prompting the environmental magazine Grist to declare in 2018 that if Wolf is a cloud truther. So I just call that into question, because we did come to find out that there is a lot of geoengineering that is happening, and we've known about it for quite a while, right? And so I think you're not wrong in calling out Naomi Klein for just kind of like now jumping on that bandwagon when it's been going on since the 70s. All right, so we're in chapter 2, Enter COVID, the threat multiplier. My first highlight is it's in the code, page 39. The fact that vaccine development was lavishly subsidized with public money is just a little fact that I wanted to call attention to and create an anchor point around, which brings us to chapter 3, My Failed Brand, or Call Me By Her Name. In this chapter, she goes over a couple of different things, like when she published No Logo, and just kind of talking about some of her personal struggles around brand and branding. But it gets really interesting on page 54 when we're talking about digital doubles. She's talking about her university students. I've highlighted that they learned to tell stories about their young lives that had less to do with the truths as they knew them than with meeting the imagined needs and requirements of an audience of strangers of certain kinds of identities. They were packaging up their trauma into a consumable commodity. And I asterisked this and wrote commoditizing emotions, because that's what a lot of influencers are doing. And I think that that's what she's calling attention to, is there's this commoditization of feeling and influencers and things like that in order to brand and label everything, specifically marketable ways, and to turn them into something fixed, saleable, and potentially profitable, since universities are themselves branded as the requisite first step to any lucrative career. Self-branding is yet another form of doubling, an internal sort of doppelganging. So calling attention to the self-brand, and why I go with the whole anti-influencer thing, and I really do like Naomi's No Logo, is like, I don't want to be an influencer. I just want to do things that make me happy and I want to share with the world. But at the same time, in order to even in the side hustle culture of the 90s, if you were to commoditize something that you were doing on the side, it does have to essentially become part of your personality. As he distilled himself down to his most marketable qualities, he told his classmates, I felt my soul leave my body. They all seemed to know how he felt. These were early days of pandemic Zoom classes, and they filled their little boxes with heart emojis. And that was what got me. That's a form of selling emotions to garnish quote unquote likes. And that's is what's happening. Like putting these room reading feedbacks into a Zoom call or a digital frame of reference. It's no longer getting the nuances of being in a classroom and getting immediate feedback from the body language of your peers. This is all very important for human development. What is an all-seeing God, if not the most effective surveillance tool ever invented? And unlike today's surveillance state, which knows only what we type, say, and do, monotheistic gods claim to know our intentions as well. And I just wrote, how soon until we reach Minority Report level? So the doubles that we perform in the digital ether, there's a menacing side, she says, because as Freud notes, it's a reminder that we will not always be alive, right? It's always reminding us that like this form of me talking is going to live in this moment forever. And it's kind of disconcerting for the conscious to think about in that sense. I think Black Mirror does a great psychoanalysis of drawing that to the forefront. These doubles who take on our sins so that we can stay pure are the stuff of monsters in doppelganger books and films. They are the projected selves that get stabbed by the protagonist, who mistakenly kill themselves in the process. These doubles are the unwanted selves that we made some kind of deal with the devil to be free of, now seeking their revenge. I thought that was like just a kind of a way to explain karma, but it's like also what keeps the conscious up at night. Try to tease out precisely how the logic of personal branding shapes the emergence of the thing that we call self. So this harkens to kind of like child labor and stuff, but it's like how soon we're pressing kids to like get involved and produce content when they're in their developmental years, like all the way even up to age 25, even in some scientific circles. And so given that knowledge, why are we trying to commoditize and capitalize on every single aspect of human living and breathing? There needs to be a balance. And I think this book does a great job adding reference points to the dichotomy that is the political spectrum. Getting approved for an apartment? What evil twins get created in this partitioning? Acute consciousness of having an externalized double, a digital double, partitioned from the real selves that serves as a role that they must perform for the benefit of others if they are to succeed. That line is deep. When you become an influencer of sorts, you never get to not be that person. So that's why it's always really important and kind of calling into question, why do so many things require us to define ourselves? At the same time, they must project the unwanted and dangerous part of themselves onto the others, the unenlightened, the problematic, the deplorable, the not me, that sharpens the borders of the me. This triad of partitioning, performing, and projecting is fast becoming a universal form of doppelganging. She's saying going on for everybody, right? We have ourselves, who we know who we are. We have this digital self that we portray to the world, and they don't see our internal workings. And then at the same time, we see our digital self, and so therefore we have to explain away the bad part of ourselves, or what I guess Jung would call the id, and we project it onto others. That is a little bit of selling entitlement concept that I covered in one of my blogs. This feeling that you are better, right? This othering that she's going to go on to talk about. It's something that needs to be focused on, because I think that fact, that substrate, that nugget that she's focusing on, that I think needs to be taken and moved up a level on the 3D/4D chessboard that is geopolitics, geoeconomics, and focus that there is a universal truth to deception on both sides of the aisle and some of the tactics that they use on the populace. A digital doppelganger can deliver everything our culture trains us to want: fame, adulation, riches, but it's a precarious wish. Omnipresent and very real possibility of having your email or social media accounts hacked, I've highlighted, which is very true. The more noise you make, the more people see you and interact with you through your videos, the more they think they know you. Anyway, she goes on to talk about there's a fake Naomi Wolf, and then Wolf has a conspiracy about the conspiracy. And I just thought that that was really interesting, because yes, while some of the stuff may seem cuckoo to some people, having a conspiracy about conspiracies is still just a healthy line of logical thinking, but still the burden of proof exists. And so that's the issue. You can have your thoughts and opinions, but you're not allowed to think people are crazy for having conspiracy theories. They are crazy if they don't want to accept any proof to the otherwise. As in so many doppelganger tales, doing a better job of being her than she ever did. And so that's kind of what the tale entails behind doppelganging and doppelganger, is like this other person, right? This AI self that might become of these videos that I make. This person will be better than me as the human being, because it will be sort of perfect, and it'll be an ideal that's hard to equal, right? It'll be like the Jesus version, the perfect version. And this fantasy is fast becoming a reality in late 2022. And I just underlined that and wrote AI, because we had this magic avatar craze using Lenza, talks about the CGI self, and then she talks about the sexualization that can happen through AI and CGI and the internet and things like that, and the artificial self, and having the self-esteem destroying capability of like yourself destroying your own self-esteem because of something done maliciously by somebody else through no consent of your own. This is a warning that recurs often in doppelganger books and films. Be careful about falling in love with your projection. It could overtake you. And I thought that, I just wrote that was me as a financial advisor, which is a side story, but essentially early on I thought that was the route that I had to take. And so this version of me came to be and came to exist that wasn't truly me. It wasn't who I was. It wasn't my core personality. It wasn't wasn't what I wanted to be, and it's never what I thought I would be growing up. It became this doppelganger version of me that was acting out through the shadow self in many ways. And so that was just a great reflection and reminder, almost so much so that when she goes on to start talking about Bannon, and Bannon talking about this Dave in accounting who leads a dreary and unremarkable life but turns into Ajax, the gun-toting, video game playing evil slayer when he's at home. Now, who's more real? Bannon asked. Dave or Ajax? You might say Dave, but Bannon saw it differently. In quotes, people take on the digital selves that are more perfected version of themselves and where they can control things in a digital way that they can't control in the analog world, he said of gamers. So he explained Dave should back down and let Ajax take over. I want Dave in accounting to be Ajax in real life, Bannon told The Atlantic's Jennifer Senior. And so that just hit really, really deep, because there is kind of this deep down feeling that, at least as a young gamer, I felt that it's like, oh, if only I could be this cool in real life. But you can't experience everything. Video games give you that chance. Video games also accentuates part of your personality that you may not know that you even had. And so it's something to be careful of and something to study and observe within yourself and be self-reflective of to help better your growth. She goes on to say, Naomi Klein does, that Bannon appears to have no desire to make Dave's life better, to help him lead a life from which he would not need to escape. And I just said, what's wrong with video games? I don't think that video games are an escapist mechanism. I think they're just like any good fiction book, or even a non-fiction book, depending on what game you get. I think it's a great way to interact with history and with creativity. They're very much artwork in many ways. They're very beautiful. People put a lot of time into crafting them, and it's no different than any other craft or art or storytelling, or even for writing a book. Legacy avatars, all right, we need to be careful, is what I said. So these people are doing grief tech, essentially, which are creating legacy avatars, which of course, like, no doubt, with my 700 something videos, something could be created of me, but at what price and at what ethical cost? So she says the students that she teaches are troubled by where all of this doubling is leading. And then, instead of expounding on that thought or that theory, she just says, nonetheless, shutting it down, almost all feel duty bound to participate in creating their own digital doubles on social media, as do I. And like, thirded, as do I, because the future is digital and content is the future. And whether my content is extraordinary or boring, it still needs to exist in this digital ether in so many ways to help accomplish some of the things that I want to accomplish. And without having that foundation, then I can't call on this and draw on this to create something that would be analogous of being worthy, right? And so where does that pressure come from? Why does that duty penetrate many of us on the left and the right? Where does that ulterior motive come from? And that's what we should look for. She knew there was something wrong with a culture that valued public performances of a virtuous self over more tangible solidarities and relationship building. And there's trueness to that. The public performances, it's not so glamorous, and perfection is boring. And so I think as time goes on, people are going to seek the more real, the more raw, the more unscripted and actual content as time goes on. Brown calls this brutal branding a biometric technology. Today, biometric identification. And so the same function, Brown makes the case like, okay, and so this is a professor of African and African diaspora studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Wow, all right. So the mic died during the last recording, so I'm going to have to start over, and that is okay. We were talking about Professor Brown calling the brutal branding a biometric technology. Today, biometric identification is the recruitment of a permanent part of the body to measure and track. So she makes the case, Professor Brown does, that the physical branding of the slaves played the same function for enslavers, allowing them to track racialized bodies via a permanent, unchangeable marker. The permanence of the brand was its power, irrepressible will to be free. Okay, the permanence of the brand was this power. It was designed to follow the enslaved person for the rest of their life, insurance against the irrepressible will to be free. And I just wrote in the margins, we are wage slaves for brands, right? We spend our money to perpetuate keeping a brand on our body. Given these roots, the casualness with which our culture has come to discuss the idea that humans should strive to be brands is itself a kind of violent erasure. Individual now fully in charge of their own commodification. And she really dives into that later on in the book, and it's what we need to watch out for. There is you, and then there is brand you. Countless numbers of us are doubled, all partitioning and performing ourselves. It becomes harder for anyone to know what is real and what and who can be trusted. Which of our opinions are genuine and which of them are for show? What doesn't ever get said or shared because it's off brand? Lily Singh announced that she was was taking a hiatus from YouTube, she explained that the platform is a machine and it makes creators believe that we have to pump out content consistently, even at the cost of our life. A machine, in other words, that turns people into machines. I thought that was kind of deep and maybe a little foreshadowy. Professed pain of wealthy influencers, even especially when the influencers are roughly the same age as the students, the undergraduates. I said, if they're wealthy influencers, why are you focusing on the money? We have to define what is wealth. That is the important context. She uses the buzzword of attention economy, which is you got to be careful of. Yes, I'm wounded. Can't you see that I'm bleeding here? So talking about like breakdowns of certain influencers because of overexposure and self-exposure, and they're kind of pleading their fans like, I'm wounded. Can't you see that I'm bleeding here, metaphorically? And then she says, forgetting that the pack loves blood and there's nothing bloodier than performative trauma. So like the pack loves to see everything crash and crumble. They love the terror and the destruction. Singular personality disorder. She's wrapping up the chapter with Dr. Richard Schwartz suggests there are actually more than two parts in ourselves. Every self is made up of a multiplicity or mosaic of often contradictory voices, hopes, and urges. In extreme cases, however, the capacity to have an internal dialogue or roundtable discussion of various parts of ourselves is healthy and human, right? I am not my thoughts. I am not my thoughts. If you're able to have a healthy conversation with the various parts of yourself, and that's the important thing that Nietzsche teaches with the element of the id, the shadow self, this part of you that you're willing to accept that yes, you can play out these evil fantasies because you are capable, but that does not mean that you are going to. You are not your thought, right? You are stuck in a bad thought and it's not who you are, and you're able to overcome that shadow self, that person that is not real. And being able to define it, I think, is what many people aren't able to do and what holds them back. It is when everyday people lose their capacity for internal dialogue and deliberation and find themselves only able to regurgitate slogans and contradictory platitudes that great evil occurred. Okay, so we have to be aware of that within ourselves. If we're going to read Sun Tzu, Art of War, and Ancient Military Strategy, and we're not going to use the contrarian thinking in order to turn that on ourselves and in order to better ourselves, we need to make sure that we're staying open-minded, we're having an internal dialogue, and then we're having deliberation with ourselves and not having this thoughtlessness, and we're not falling prey to slogans and platitudes. In the state of literal thoughtlessness, i.e. an absence of thoughts of one's own, totalitarianism takes hold. But differently, we should not fear having voices in our heads. We should fear the absence. And I think that's the key to things like 1984, and what's going to be pointed out is that there are so many things that take the voices out of our head and remove our ability to talk and have an internal dialogue to really know what's going on. Brands are not built to contain our multitude. They demand fixedness, stasis, one singular self or person. Everybody wants to define you, but as Sun Tzu says, you have to be undefinable, an enigma. That would be a problem at any time in history, but in a moment like ours, with so many collective crises demanding our deliberation and debate, the stakes feel civilizational. And I have to just stop and ask why. Why does it feel civilizational? What are we falling prey to? Again, looking at this through the lens of manufacturing consent. Is this actually happening? And that's what so many people are trying to call attention to about the COVID pandemic, is because they saw differently than what they saw on the TV. Far easier to master ourselves, the brand called you, to polish it, burnish it, and get the angle and effect just right. It's a grand illusion. And so the question remains, what aren't we building when we are building our brands? That is a good question, right? Communism very much likes that question. What aren't we building while we were focusing ourselves? Whereas we know from guys like Milton Friedman, the best thing to do is to better yourself at all times. By bettering yourself, you're going to better the world around you. And the only way that's possible is through certain thought processes. Chapter 4, meeting myself in the woods. I didn't make any highlights because that's going to bring us to part 2, mirror world. It opens up with a quote from 1984 talking about doublethink. Chapter 5 is entitled, They Know About Cell Phones. A little bit of talk about CCP, social credit score, IBM, Nazi Germany, the roads not taken. Unfortunately, there was never a truly mass organizing strategy to push for that kind of ambitious agenda, so governments rarely felt obliged to consider it seriously, opting instead for the easier and big donor-friendly route of looking to vaccines and verification apps to carry almost the entire load of virus control in North America and Europe. Like so much else in our culture, from abusive labor practices to climate breakdown, the burden of pandemic responses was shifted from the collective to the individual, and all in the name of getting back to business as usual. And it turned to each other. Did you get your jab? Showing us proof. We didn't ask ask the employers if they provided a safe workplace. Okay, so the ambitious agenda is quoted as, "We cannot rely on pharmaceutical technology alone. We have to use all of the social, economic, and political technologies at our disposal. Just as much tools as vaccines and antivirals, like social distancing, masking, paid leave, eviction prevention, community harm reduction, upgraded ventilation, infrastructure investments, Medicare for all, debt cancellation, decarceration, and so much more. These are just some of the potential social and fiscal tools that we could use to help people not just survive the pandemic, but thrive in spite of it." I think a lot of that is true and merits further discussion. Tapping into our tech fears. I've tabbed, "The surprising assertion turned out to be a reference to Daily Clout, a then obscure, low-traffic website that hosted her blogs and videos and also made the eyebrow-raising claim of being a technological breakthrough because it allowed easy access to pieces of draft legislation by putting them online. Never mind that U.S. bills are already public and online elsewhere via free sites like govtrack.us. Before she started making the rounds on Fox, the site which claimed to turn everyday people into lobbyists, govtrack.us, is the important takeaway from that U.S. bills are public and online via free websites, the govtrack.us. My next tab is, "The word she was saying was essentially fantasy. But emotionally, to the many people now listening to her, they clearly felt true. And the reason they felt true is that we indeed are living through a revolution in surveillance tech. And state and corporate actors have indeed seized outrageous powers to monitor us, often in collaboration and coordination with one another. Moreover, as a culture, we have barely begun to reckon with the transformational nature of this shift." And I think that's what this book does a great job bringing to the focal point as of what this is doing to us as a society. Here is a non-snide version of the "wait until they hear about cell phones" quip. They know all about cell phones. They just don't know what to do about cell phones, or smart speakers, or search histories, or shadow banning, or email and social media metadata. And neither, it seems, does anyone else, including those in power, who are patently unwilling to rein into what the Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism. Just saying, it's interesting that she calls that, and that is something that we like to and need to focus on. My next tab is under digital golems. "I'd rather see an ad for cute shoes than I'm going to like to see an ad for a bunch of ugly stuff I don't want," one student said in an early class. "In our discussions, we came to call this the cute shoes problem because it encapsulates one of the many main reasons why surveillance capitalism and the AI revolution were able to sneak up on us with so little debate. Many of us do appreciate a certain level of automated customization, especially algorithms that suggest music, books, and people who might interest us. And at first, the stakes seemed low. Is it really a big deal if we see ads and suggestions based on our interests and tastes, or if chatbots clear our email backlogs?" I think it was a good ethical question to call into the forefront of what are we willing to give up for automation. Yet in North America, raising the alarm about the fact that we have outsourced the management of our critical information pathways to algorithms run by for-profit companies working hand in glove with government somehow became the terrain of the Bannonite political right, which points to a dangerous seeding of ideological territory. She is like, this is great because this was the champion of the left, and somehow like that got switched, and so now the right has taken over. Oh my gosh, like phones and everything, we're monitoring us. It's a digital prison. I think it's a digital panopticon of sorts. I think this is a great image to bring and show and call to attention that we all need to unite on the left and the right and form a strong centered around some certainly American values. Also, I tabbed, "The plan is to get you to send them money to join their wars." And this is the gamification of a lot of it. This is the gamification of conspiracy theories, the capitalism behind conspiracy theories, the capitalism behind media. The more that they stimulate the amygdala, the more that they stimulate the brain, the more focus and attention of yours that they keep, the more they can put commercials and ads in front of you. And that's just the game. That's just the game. That's just what you have to be aware of. And so you have to be in control and take that time back for yourself and be careful about what agenda is being fed, because any agenda can lead to overconsumption of the wrong information, especially when it becomes a for-profit venture. Chapter 6, Diagonal Lines. I don't have much tabbed or highlighted. On page 102 under Diagonal Lines, "This was meant to trigger memories of Nazi-era race hygiene, as if the Nazi atrocity of treating human beings as germs and treating germs as germs was anyway the same thing. Inspired by the term Kordinkin, but taking it beyond Germany, William Callison and Quinn Slobodian, both scholars of European politics, describe these emergent political alliances as diagonalism. They explain both in part from transformations in technology and communication. Diagonalists tend to contest conventional monikers of left and right, while generally arcing towards far-right beliefs." Why does everything have to be about the far right? Like, you have to define what the far right is. You can't just say anything you don't like is far right. To express ambivalence, if not cynicism, towards parliamentary politics, and to blend convictions about holism and even spirituality with a dogged discourse of individual liberties. At the extreme end, diagonal movements share a conviction that all all power is conspiracy. Okay, so if we're going to define this diagonalism, and then we're going to say like, oh, well, like they arc towards far right beliefs. Well, what does that say? If these people, diagonalists, which I read as people in the center, people with a brain who have adapted to changes in technology and communication and are using it to advance the individual liberties that they have, blend convictions about holism and spirituality. Okay, so what is wrong with any of this? Ambivalence, cynicism towards parliamentary politics? Well, yeah, politics has been proven to be a farce. It has been proven to be theater, political theater. There's a reason it's called political theater. It's a show. And so I'm not saying that it's a show, and just because we don't want to go in lockstep with whatever you believe doesn't make these diagonalist thinkers far right. It just means they're adapting to technological change and the efficient market of communication. None of this is anything but an evolution, and maybe they're right. Let's just read a little bit more. Despite claims of post-partisanship, it is right-wing, often far-right political parties around the world that have managed to absorb the unruly passions and energy of diagonalism. So she uses a bunch of buzzwords, COVID-era grievances from pre-existing projects opposing wokeness and drumming up fears of migrant invasions. Okay, so politics, okay, to the claim to be something new beyond traditional left-right polls. Yeah, maybe we adapted in advance. Maybe it's time to admit that the 2D chess game of red versus blue is nothing but regressive for the bell curve of the majority of society, that it might be time to literally update the human race. And just because you don't like the potential direction that's going to take the world in doesn't mean you have to call it far right and extremism. I just don't understand what's so wrong with wanting to be in touch with your creator or spirituality with Mother Earth while also being suspicious of the powers that be that have been proven to be behind a massive propaganda machine. This is all nested in a book by an author who is very anti-capitalist in many ways. And so I don't see why you can't get on board with that and you have to say, oh, it's far right. Well, define what's far right about it. Please define that. You didn't define it. Klondike COVID. Disaster doppelgangers. The opposite of canceled. Chapter 7, Magus plus one-way glass, reverse marionettes, my first tab. So why didn't we invest in outdoor conversation and recreation programs that have pried them away from the screens and put them in communities of other young people, generated meaningful work for our ailing planet, and lifted the spirits all at the same time? Yeah, Naomi, you have the answers for everything. No, that is a good idea, though. Again, you point these obvious things out that this would have been the obvious answer, and there's plenty of people just as smart as you who probably were saying the same thing, but maybe didn't have the same political ideology as you, so you didn't agree. And it does lead people to question, why did they impose this outcome to stay inside, to separate, to be attached to the screens? What was it about enforcing unhealthy habits on the entirety of the planet? It just makes us question. Once again, Bannon has identified a neglected issue with cross-partisan appeal. Many leftists are concerned about the dehumanizing impacts tech on workers treated as extensions of machines. She says, I know I am. Not to mention the dystopian possibilities of a future in which the rich can buy genetic upgrades for themselves and their kids. Many conservatives, meanwhile, oppose this kind of techno-fetishism for different reasons. They see it as an affront to God's plan. Right, you guys have common ground. And if a diagonalist agrees with that, why is that far right? She said she's not surprised that messages like this are resonating. For years, I was part of international left movements that protested outside meetings of the World Trade Organization, the World Economic Forum in Davos, G8 summits, the IMF for their roles in undermining democracies and advancing the interests of transnational capital in the United States. We called out both major parties for being beholden to corporate donors and serving the rich rather than the people who voted them into office. Right? Like, we can champion this. This was the energy behind Occupy Wall Street and then behind Bernie, and that coursed through various battles against new oil and gas projects. But our movement never won power. Well, that's because Bernie was your champion. You can't pick a guy like that with a dirty background to champion those ideals. Today, it is Melanie denouncing a system in which everyone is reduced to being perfect consumer slaves, quote unquote, only instead of offering an analysis of capital, a system that must enclose all aspects of life inside the market in order to mine them as new profit centers. She blames a lot of people, from immigrants to internationalism and the left, for a hollowness of the core of modernity. She rails against big financial speculators, but she has no policies to rein them in. Still, you can't blame a strategist for being strategic, and it's highly strategic to pick up the resonant issues that your opponents have carelessly left unattended. And that is one of the things that she wants to paint a picture with in this book, is that there's a lot of things that do need to be addressed, and you can't be scared to address. You have to take it and run with it and stand up. As part of building MAGA Plus, Bannon has made clear efforts to tone down the overt racism of his show. Opposition to what he calls border warfare is still a pillar of the project, but alongside it is a great deal of talk about what he now calls inclusive nationalism. Bannon claims, and polling supports this claim, that growing numbers of Black and Latino people, particularly men, are open to voting Republican, in part over frustrations with how COVID measures affected their jobs and small businesses, and also over discomfort with their kids coming home with unfamiliar ideas about the mutability of gender. If the majority of people are worried about it, the voters that you quote unquote care about, but if they're agreeing with the other side, maybe it's time to make some concessions and come to terms. Rebrand complete, which brings us to chapter 8, ridiculously serious, seriously speechless. Something about when Trump, after the 2016 election, accused half the press corps of being fake news, he was beginning a process that would lead his supporters to doubt everything they read and watched in the mainstream press. But he was also doing something else. He was appropriating a term that had been used by communication scholars to describe a very real phenomenon: manufactured propaganda that is designed to seem like real news but is entirely made up. Okay, you literally just are like, oh, okay, yeah, Noam Chomsky is right in manufacturing that. There's a propaganda machine out there, and he's just putting a name on it, calling it fake news. How dare he? Wait a second. No, he's responding, right? He's not trying to come up with a new term that he's like, I made this up. No, he's just taking on what is a good buzz term as opposed to trying to explain manufactured propaganda. You call it fake news, it's a lot easier to say. Can't blame a strategist for being a strategist. All right, I've got 2 tabs on these 2 paragraphs. Okay, so, but the former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, and other tech billionaires seized on the stopgap emergency measures to push for more permanent changes that would represent huge profit-making opportunities for their sector. Everything from moving large parts of education permanently online to creating so-called smart cities, which would radically increase the surveillance of daily life. The future they were seeing in the crisis was one in which not only our homes are never again exclusively personal spaces, but also via high-speed digital connectivity, our schools, our doctors' offices, our gyms, and if determined by the state, our jails. It was a grim AI-enabled version of a touchless society that would employ far fewer teachers, doctors, and drivers. It would accept no cash and have skeletal mass transit and far less live art. Naomi, you see it so clearly. All of these trends were underway pre-pandemic, but during those early months of lockdown, they underwent a warp speed acceleration. None of what I wrote in my reporting was speculative. It was based on public statements from tech companies as well as documents released under the U.S. Freedom of Information Act. Something resembling a coherent pandemic shock doctrine was beginning to emerge, which I playfully called the Green New Deal. The Green New Reset. Under this section I have tabbed, I remember the moment when it hit me how dangerous this Pupa King had become. I was writing an article about hard right local politicians in Northern California had ordered police to evict survivors of the state's deadliest wildfire from the tents where some were living in public parks. I typed a sentence about it being an ominous portent of an eco-fascist future, in which ecological fears are harnessed to rationalize the violent security crackdowns against those deemed lesser humans, often immigrants and the poor. Eco-fascism is a real threat, and it is becoming more explicit on parts of the right, but I deleted the term in favor of eco-authoritarianism. A bit weaker, but throwing the term fascism around is what other Naomi does, and hadn't she helped make the very word absurd? Then I realized what I had done. Eco-fascism is the accurate term to describe the threat, and how convenient it is for coalescing fascist forces if the term has been so abused in Pipic that anti-fascists are loath to use it accurately to describe the events in the real world. And I would just call into the courtroom F.A. Hayek and the road to serfdom, and I would just say that, at the end of the day, whether we go all the way to the left or all the way to the right, all the way to the left and all the way to the right, it does come full circle. The full circle happening happens, and fascism can come out of a totalitarianism economic left as well as a politically fascist right. We have to be careful, and I think you do a great job of portraying the danger that is coming and we are not prepared for. And yet, on almost every front, tangible ground is being lost. Changing the discourse did not prevent the world's 10 richest men from doubling their collective fortunes from $700 billion to $1.5 trillion in the first 2 years of the pandemic. It did not stop police forces from increasing their budgets while teachers have to pay for basic supplies out of pocket. It did not prevent fossil fuel companies from collecting more billions in subsidies and new permits. It did not prevent the Israeli police forces from attacking the funeral of the Palestinian American journalist. Anywho, in many ways, nothing has really changed at all, but at the same time, everything has changed. That wraps up the chapter, and she says this would all be so ridiculous if it weren't so serious. Which brings us to 9. Far right meets the far out. My first tab is, I'd first validate their fears about data. Tell them that your top priority is safeguarding their privacy and keeping their personal information out of the hands of private tech companies. Pivot the conversation to the need to regulate those companies, break them up, treat them as public utilities, guarantees everyone's right to be a part of a digital town square, show them that there is a way to stick it to big tech without putting their life and other people's lives in danger. I think that's something to think on, especially in today's environment when tech can be used for so much good or so much evil. On the next page, I have tabbed this paragraph. Among such narratives is the one that the climate justice movement has been telling for years, the same one Avi was running on, her husband. People of good conscience across all the lines meant to divide us can band together, build power, and transform our societies into something fairer and greener just in the nick of time. But that story is getting harder to believe with each day that goes by. So another narrative, this one spreading much faster, goes like this. I'll be okay. I'm prepared. With my canned goods and solar panels and relative place of privilege on this planet, it's other people who will suffer. The trouble with that narrative, though, is that it requires finding ways to live with and rationalize the mass suffering of others. And that's where the stories and logics that cast other people's death as an unavoidable form of natural selection, perhaps even a blessing, come into play. So she's illuminating a dark side of human nature. And I know that ideologically we want to save everybody as best as we can, but we also are animals at the end of the day. And while I do applaud and laud the fight to be the better person and take care of everybody, capitalism hasn't done that. Capitalism is exploitative, and this is the end. If this is the end point of the system of capitalism or the downfall of the American empire, thanks to globalization, etc., then we need to wonder why that is. And this relative place of privilege that you talk about, it's powerful wording. It's powerful wording in a great perspective, and we need to all take a collective step back to reassess the situation, especially with the climate crisis. We know that we're exiting the Holocene, and we have the scientific capability. Quit making it political. If the planet's heating up, let's just find the scientific path forward, not the political path forward. And if the scientists say the climate is changing, then that's true, right? Because we're exiting an ice age, things are going to get warmer. But let's accept it for what it is and tackle it with open-mindedness and open hearts, and not the closed, rigged system of capitalism, right? Like, that's a fair argument, I think, that we could maybe proceed on. There is, moreover, still huge value in what is broadly termed wellness. Many of us lead dangerously sedentary lives. Our work demands it. Chances are that moving our bodies and whatever free time we have will make us healthier and feel better. Food prepared with fresh ingredients is more nourishing than fast food picked up on the fly. None of it will prevent death or deliver eternal youth, but it's good to be active and strong. Good to eat nutrient-rich foods. Good to expand the horizons of health beyond big pharma's fixes. Everyone should have access to those kinds of options wherever they live, along with the time and resources to take advantage of them, which is far from the case today. I mean, and it is true because of the oppression and the inability to move around. And so that's why, if you don't like America, get out, right? But that's why so many people want to be here in the United States, in the Europe, and any first world countries. I have a big paragraph tab on page 189. What would we see if we, like the couple in that pre-Raphaelite painting, met ourselves in the woods? I fear that many of us would also faint from fright, because in mapping the contours of the mirror world, I can't avoid seeing that the mindset that is the poison at the heart of this strange and tragic chapter reaches well beyond the diagonalist axis. On this side of the glass, how much do we push our governments to keep mask mandates in place to protect the immunocompromised, or to make clean, filtered indoor air a right in every workplace, or to share the vaccines beyond our borders? In North America and Europe, our governments wanted us to get our second and third shots. What if we had refused until everyone in the world had their first one? What bodies did we tacitly sacrifice by going with the flow? And how much of those of us who were lucky enough to work from home do to make sure that the workers we celebrated as essential were actually paid and protected as if they were essential? Did we fight for the right to organize, or did we keep ordering from Amazon simply because it was convenient? The truth is that most of us could have done much more. Yeah, I think we all could have done much more depending on how we stand. And I think a lot of people did do much more, but you don't want to recognize what some people were doing, and some people were sacrificing, and some people were speaking out because you were told by certain media outlets and certain political interests that this is the way things are, when there was a massive percentage of people trying to say, no, this is how we see it. We don't want to believe what we're being told because we're not seeing this for ourselves with our eyes. Chapter 10, Autism and the Anti-Vax Prequel. I think in this chapter she talks about the one guy who started off the whole thing, Wakefield. There he is, yes. So she talks about Wakefield, debunks it. I think H Bomber Guy does a great video on it. Time Suck and Dan Cummins, they also do a great job recapping that, and that's essentially what that was. So I'm not going to go over Wakefield's story. There's plenty out there on it. At the core of this democratic socialist experiment under palaces for children was the radical new idea that children were not mere appendages of the parents, nor were their futures predestined by their class, nor should the goal of education be an indoctrination in obedience or the preparation of poor children for lives of servitude. Based on breakthroughs in the understanding of children's complex inner lives, this was Freud's hometown. Viennese policymakers adopted the belief that children had rights of their own and that the role of education was to unlock their full potential. As the socialist education theorist Otto Felix Kanix wrote in 1925, no longer subjugated, no longer robbed of the joys of childhood, no longer threatened by the lie of being objects of charity, these children can grow into proud, free, complete, and creative individuals. I guess I like that for some reason. Looks like it's several pages and parts later until my next tab, which takes us to part 3, Shadowlands. Chapter 11 is Calm, Conspiracy, and Capitalism. On the next page, I've tabbed, from the researcher's perspective, the differences between the genres should be glaring. Responsible investigators follow a set of shared standards, double and triple source, verify leaked documents, cite peer-reviewed studies, come clean about uncertainties, share sections of text with recognized experts to make sure technical terms and research methods are correctly understood, have fact-checkers comb through it all pre-publication, then hand it all over to a libel lawyer, or in the case of my books, multiple lawyers in different territories. It's a slow, expensive, careful process. It gets us as close as we know to something we all agree was proof that something was true. Okay, this is very important that you call it out, but some things that were placed forth to us weren't triple, double, and triple checked. We just have to make sure that we know, and we're addressing and adding new facts to the conversation as they've come to light now in 2024. There was no need for histrionics about how much unvaccinated people were experiencing apartheid when there was a real vaccine apartheid between rich and poor countries. No need to cook up fantasies about COVID internment camps when the virus was being left to rip through prisons, meat packing plants, and the Amazon warehouses as if the people's lives inside had no value at all. So that is powerful that the poor countries didn't get it because it wasn't subsidized by the fiat currency capitalist globalized system. And so if it were real, like if it were a real biological warfare attack gone wrong, or a leak as it were, but if it were a conspiracy, it did what it was supposed to do, right? Like if it was a conspiracy, then it killed enough people that it didn't matter because they were in the poor countries and couldn't have access to it. So, and just to remember, and she says the Amazon warehouse workers, the meat packing plants, and the prisons, right? The people who are still people were left to just be annihilated as if they had no value. So just like an animal farm, all the animals are equal except the pigs. The pigs are more equal than the other animals. I think about those words often. Calm is not a replacement for righteous rage or fury at injustice, both of which are powerful drivers for necessary change. If shock induced a loss of identity, then calm is the condition under which we return to ourselves. Berger helped me see that the search for calm is why I write, to tame the chaos in my surroundings, in my own mind, and I hope in the minds of my readers as well. The information is almost always distressing, to many shocking, but my view, the goal should never be to put readers into a state of shock. It should be to pull them out of it. And then she says the conspiracy is capitalism in the title, and I've tabbed the first part of the first paragraph of that. And I think that why I write on my website and my diaries and why I read is similar to this, is because I want to help people come out of the shock that is everything bombarded on us with the information of today's day and age is meant to stress us out. The conspiracy is capitalism. I've highlighted the first paragraph under this section. Here is where things get more complicated, as they invariably do in the realm of doppelgangers. When radical and anti-establishment writers and scholars attempt to analyze the underlying systems that build and uphold power in our world, including the proven existence of covert operations to eliminate threats to those systems, it is common for them to be dismissed as conspiracy theorists. In truth, it is one of the most battle-worn tactics used to bury and marginalize ideas that are inconvenient to those who wield economic and political power, right? So if you have the money, you can bury an idea because it's not against your agenda or it doesn't benefit your corporation or your company. The tactics that we saw of Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, and all of the old ones, Westinghouse and more, or we all know these old tactics of the game of capitalism. Okay, but that leaves out the most important factor I've highlighted. Whether the theory in question is false or at least unproven, because plenty of events and situations, from financial crises, energy shortages, wars, are indeed manipulated behind the scenes by powerful forces, she says, and the effects of those manipulations on everyday people are intensely negative, and we are crying out. And so she knows and is acknowledging the hotbed that COVID was landing on because of the conspiracy theories that she's even pointed out in some of her books. And we've got books like Manufacturing Consent, which just go to prove it further. And then we we have everything that does come to light and the internet to thank for uncovering a lot as well. And so we have to understand that the world that COVID was born into was rife and loaded and primed to launch into something crazy. So that's why we have to take the rational step back and do the probing and triple checking and verifying and making sure that people didn't make the agenda political and they made it about health and human wellness and equality of outcome, because if it is a virus, everybody is a person and everybody is sacred. Believing that does not make you a conspiracy theorist. She finishes the paragraph with, it makes you a serious observer of politics and history. And this is the point that a lot of people don't get to, is that I think that there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of back and forth on both sides. But the truth of the matter is, we're all observers of politics and history because it enshrouds so much of our life, whether we like it or not. We just have to remember that politics is like the 2D, it's the checkers amongst the 3D chessboard, right? Like the Star Trek chessboard that's 5D chess, etc. We have to be able to think dimensionally and be able to go back in time. We are time travelers because we have brains and we can think to past and predict future, anticipate future events. And so get out of the third dimension, realize that you're a fourth dimensional being, and that we know that we can even think in the fifth and sixth, even eighth and ninth dimensions. Scientists have discovered of 12. And so being able to build out that lattice work in your head of differing angles, different stories, and making sure to come to a rational, logical conclusion while doing what I think Naomi does so well in championing people's rights and the rights of the everyday person against the elites. And so I think what she's on to here is something very prescient and very important to discuss. And I think that more of us need to be able to separate ourselves from that red versus blue mentality and know that we are still the 99% versus the small elite. Further down, I've highlighted, it's also logic behind the offloading of COVID response onto the individual. Wear your mask, get your jab, to the exclusion of those bigger ticket investments in strengthening public schools, hospitals, and transit systems. She goes on to talk about the elites, the ones who bankroll the political and media projects, being pitted against non-rich people. I highlighted the prevailing and correct sense that society is rigged against the majority and that the important truths are being hidden behind pat political rhetoric because we cannot change what we do not understand, and because the system is rigged and most people are indeed getting screwed, but without a firm understanding of capitalism's drive to find new profit sources to enclose and extract. Many will imagine there is a cabal of uniquely nefarious individuals pulling the strings. Okay, and that's why we study the books of capitalism. That's why I have Capitalism and Freedom up on the channel. That's why we've read Road to Serfdom. That's why I probably should read Marx. I don't think I need to read Marx at this point because of all the refutations throughout time. But this is why we read Economics and the Historian. This is why we go through this, because we have to understand this system that we're living in. We have to understand the system of capitalism, and it commoditizes everything about the human, right? Cyberpunk 2077 is a dystopian video game that outlines a future where the corporations pretty much rule everything and all the parts of your body can be replaced. It's commoditized, it can be upgraded, and I think the internet is great at commoditizing emotions in so many ways. It sells this entitlement culture. It sells this feeling of what she was talking about a few pages ago about like the end of the world. Well, at least we have our relative place of privilege. Everyone else will suffer. This is like the kind of emotion and mindset that capitalism gets down to. It has to compartmentalize every little thing to extract some revenue or profit in the name of growth. And that's why the joke is that, when the world ends, you'll put oxygen in a bottle and charge people to breathe, because it can be that bad if unchecked morally. We may disagree. I think that there's a lot of strength for the moral argument for capitalism, and that I think Masterson does a great job in his business book, Ready, Aim, Fire, about the businessman can only gain his profits after doing good, after delivering whatever it is the market desires. And the market is made of people. Market is, right, the 99% are the consumers. So anyway, just an interesting thought process to go through. Further down, she says that Naomi Wolf was suggesting it's just an example of plain old capitalism doing its thing, finding new and novel ways to commodify every aspect of life. So I thought that was important because it does kind of call to attention this whole influencer culture that we have happening. I've got a big paragraph highlighted here incoming. Jack Bradich, a Rutgers University communications scholar with a focus on conspiracies, explained this possible trajectory to me like this. Liberal investments in individualism result in thinking of power as residing in individuals and groups rather than structures. Without an analysis of capital or class, they end up defaulting to the stories the West tells itself about the power of the individual to change the world. But hero narratives easily flip into villain narratives. This is a crucial point. Conspiracy culture does not challenge the hyper-individualism that is at the heart of so many crises reaching their breaking points. Instead, it mirrors it, putting all the blame for society's ills on a singularly powerful individual: Fauci, Gates, Schwab, Soros. So to go back, that sentence, without an analysis of capital or class, they end up defaulting to the stories the West tells itself about the power of the individual to change the world. The manifest destiny, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps story is what Jack is talking about here. And hero narratives easily flip into villain narratives. And this is a crucial point. Conspiracy culture does not challenge the hyper individualism that is at the heart of so many crises reaching their breaking points. Instead, it mirrors it, putting all the blame on one person. It's easy to point and it's easy to think of all of that. And so we have to be careful. And I think Dan Cummins with Time Suck did a great podcast on this about why that is. And I think to take it a step further and look at it from a geopolitical point of view, the reason that these people are placed behind, like the Bill Gates is one example, George Soros, Rothschild, these are the names that people ascribe to these grand conspiracies. And I think he does a great job of pointing out that, that's not quite the case. And here's why. And there's not a whole lot of proof, etc. But at the same time, you have to think even above that and to project that evil onto somebody in order to take the blame off of you as a nation, say China or Russia, and you get to place it on Bill Gates, even though it's your influence, you're the hidden manipulator. That's the win-win for the nation that is attempting to exploit or gain an advantage for war, depending on your culture. Some conspiracies are real. Page 235. We're going to read the opening paragraph and then move on. Understanding how capitalism in its latest stage shapes and distorts our world can offer some stability. It does not, however, preclude the presence of real-world provable conspiracies. If we define conspiracy as an agreement among members of a group to pull off some kind of nefarious plot in the shadows, representatives of capital and government and the corporate sector engage in conspiracies in a matter of course. The most certainly was a CIA-backed conspiracy in the early 1970s to overthrow the democratically elected social president of Chile, Salvador Allende, after he nationalized the copper mines, as there was in 1953 overthrows Iran's prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, after he moved to nationalize the oil company that would become British Petroleum. And she talks about in her book, The Shock Doctrine, and the counter history of the rise of neoliberalism through well-documented plots. And I think it's fantastic that we have the author saying conspiracies are real. These happen. I have proof of them. We know that they're happening. And so let's just accept that. Oh, look, an Adam Smith quote that I didn't highlight. In The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, Adam Smith wrote, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or some contrivance to raise prices." The English writer and publisher Mark Fisher went further, remarking in 2013 that much of what is packaged as conspiracies today is the ruling class showing class solidarity, by which he meant that it's mostly just ultra-rich people in business and government having one another's back. That's the conspiracy. And I think when you approach investing, say, from that point of view, knowing that, hey, we went to the same elite college, we're buddy, those people, their values are going to align somehow, their interests might align somehow, and that's going to advance some agenda, right? We know from other books that any successful investor or anyone who's done anything, whether it be start a business or do something great, they've always had help. They've always had people who saw the same vision as they did and helped reach that same outcome. So if that's the case, we need to make sure we're all on the same page, right? Because what is the vision that we want to see? And I think the vision that we have now is, of course, the vision that's winning. Abuse thrives in the Shadowlands because it can, and this in turn requires conspiratorial cover-ups to protect the perpetrators and to protect consumers who conspire to keep ourselves ignorant and innocent as we stroll through the more brightly lit parts of the supply chain. Oof. I wanted to tab that part because the Shadowlands that she talks about, it does point out, that there is some dark stuff going on in the world. And so I'm not going to go into any of that here. I highly recommend you guys get a copy of this book and check it out for yourself. Let's see. On bad days, I feel like I might explode. Impunity can drive a person mad. Maybe it can drive a whole society mad. In quotes, abuse of power begets conspiracy allegations, and the men and women of conspiratorial capital at least partly have themselves to blame for the extreme and fictitious allegations made against them. Let's see, this looks interesting. Sarah Kinswar, in her 2022 book, They Knew How a Culture of Conspiracy Keeps America Complacent. That might be a good, interesting book to read. Let's make a note. All right. Under A Fantasy of Justice, I have tabbed, but what did Democrats do when they controlled the House? To investigate the ways that intelligence agencies have cooperated with tech giants to invade privacy and surveil us in countless ways? Or to pardon whistleblowers like Snowden? Have we given up on justice on this scale? If so, we can hardly be surprised to see the impulse resurface in work form in the mirror world. A vacuum has been created, and if my doppelganger has taught me anything, it is that vacuums tend to get filled. I think that is powerful because as somebody who is in the middle politically, there's a lot about the left that slowly was winning me over. A lot of the ideologies that I thought would be possible thanks to some of the advances in technology and capitalism and human nature. But when you let the tribe take over, you lose that grasp, you lose that hold. And she's saying that there's so much that the left was championing that was doing so well to win over so many hearts and minds, and they dropped the ball for whatever reason. And she just wanted to point that out. And I think that was very, very poignant. She talks about adrenochrome, QAnon, a conspiracy theory that went viral about the elites are sucking us dry, our money, our labor, our time, our data. So dry that large parts of our planet are beginning to spontaneously combust. They're not harvesting adrenochrome, they're just harvesting everything else about us. The Davos elite aren't eating our children, but they are eating our children's futures, and that is plenty bad. QAnon believers imagine secret tunnels underneath pizza parlors in Central Park, the better to traffic children. This is fantasy, but there are tunnels, literal shadowlands under some major cities, and they do house and hide the poor, the sick, the drug dependent, and discarded. Under the flashing lights of Las Vegas, hundreds or even thousands of people really do live in a sprawling network of storm tunnels. Wow, that's crazy. That's crazy. I don't want to know anything about that, but if that's the system that's created. But that's the other thing is, you can't feed everybody because you have to look to nature. We have this book to thank for that. Like one of the most successful hedge fund managers of all time. And, I'd say in many ways, investors are psychologists of the market and of people, sociologists in many ways. And some of the things that Ray Dalio points out are just, just the facts. You can't just deny nature. You can't deny what is. You have to accept and you have to build upon. And so what is the answer for people who can't take care of themselves? I think that's why we're entering dangerous territory as scientific advances happen, because we're now able to understand more and more and more about like low IQ, high IQ, aptitude, all of this stuff, intelligence. The more we're able to define it and put parameters on it, the worse it can get for those people who don't quite meet the standard. But if you didn't meet the standard 20,000, 30,000, 50,000, 100,000 years ago, before civilization, before Christ, before the Chinese Empire, so the Chinese Empire, like 12 to 8,000 years ago, right? So long before that. And even in those times, you had to fend for yourself. The tribe was the tribe, and now we are one world. And so how does that change, and how do we evolve as humans, become one tribe? No way out but back. My first tab is the journalist Eowyn Higgins questioned the organizer about the appropriateness of co-opting a holiday so central to Black liberation for these purposes. The response: we have been enslaved by our government. Okay, like a lot of us do agree by that. Like we do think that there needs to be some major legal reform. We do think there needs to be some major culture reform. We're here for it. We're here for it. I've tabbed on page 253. Did being a white woman count as a basis for discrimination at a time when everyone was railing against the archetypal Karen? Well, maybe if a Karen can convince herself she's actually a Rosa in disguise, denied access to restaurants and transportation, and shunned by friends and family, surely by laying claim to that abrupt loss of status that would raise her status, which, let's face it, is not an entirely outlandish thing to believe at this stage of neoliberal capitalism, which has done a fine job of transforming identity-based oppression from a basis for solidarity and shared analysis, the original intention of identity politics, to its own form of currency. This mention of its own form of currency. That's what really intrigues me and is the question I'm trying to answer by reading all of these books in economics. And so whether it's Gary Vee or a book like this that we may get to one day, you guys just let me know. This experience economy, this attention economy that's coming to pass is a dangerous concept of saying, well, this is now the currency, is where is your attention focused, when that's not real. It's esoteric. Yes, currency can be intangible, but it's still based on futures. It's still based on commodities. It's still based on actual physical production. At the end of the day, we are physical beings. We have to be able to think in higher dimensions, but able to live inside of our bodies in this dimension, in this reality, with each other. A Tale of Two Truck Convoys. I didn't highlight anything, but it was basically talking about the Canada one that we all know about, and then another one that happened in Canada that nobody knew about. People knew about it, but it should have been much bigger. It was a much better reason for the convoy, but it didn't get a lot of press. Honks heard round the world. I've tabbed. Something about freezing supporters' bank accounts. The rationale for invoking the act was so loose that it set a dangerous precedent for any future action that disrupts major economic activity, whether it's a strike or an indigenous blockade. She does say that locking the bank accounts was not a good political play. It sets a very dangerous precedent. I think we can all agree on that. I too am a victim. The biggest victim is the title of the headline. It's all tilting and rolling, I tabbed. And so much like the assumed predictability of seasons will never be stable again, at least not for several generations. And that is a best case scenario. Really? Like, it's not that bad. Things have gotten back quite a little bit to normal. The only thing is the WEF has just like started saying that they're going to advance their agenda, and BlackRock and all of these big companies are buying up all the land and property, and China owns farmland, and Bill Gates is buying farmland. Chapter 13, The Nazi in the Mirror. I went to the last part of the chapter before I made my tab. Is this part of what we are seeing? Are increasingly violent conspiracy theorists in the mirror world afraid of being rounded up, treated as second class, occupied, and cold because on some level they know that these are the genocidal behaviors that created and sustained their relative but increasingly precarious privileges? Are they terrified that if the truths of the Shadowlands, past, present, and future, ever fully revealed and reckoned with, then it can only result in a dramatic role reversal, with the victims becoming the victimizers? And I think that was insightful because it does call into kind of the darkness of what capitalism does perpetuate in many ways, especially in other parts of the world where it remains unchecked. 14, The Unshakable Ethnic Double, to which I don't have too much. We've got some Satan's Army of Evil Twins, anti-Semitism talk. The Socialism of Facts is the first tab I have. One of the interesting things about digging into the history of Jew hatred is how contradictory the theories are. Are Jews greedy bankers scheming to get Christian property so we can pocket the money? Or are we rabble-rousing communists scheming to do away with capitalism altogether? A widely circulated Nazi caricature depicts the eternal Jew, a hunched man with gold coins in one hand and a map of Germany with a hammer and sickle on it in the other, somehow managing to be an arch-capitalist and revolutionary Marxist at the same time. Conspiracy theories don't require internal consistency to find traction. See, COVID is a mild cold. Chill out. COVID is a bioweapon. Freak out. Still, it's striking that the two most tenacious lines of attack that Jews have faced over the generations, the scheming Jewish bankers and the scheming Jewish Marxists, are perennially on a logical collision course with each other. She does call into a good point that many conspiracy theories, especially the ones you have to be careful of, always go back to Zionism of some sort. And we do have to be careful of who we start hating, because yes, whether it's Islam, Jews, or Christians, especially Catholics, like there are organizations that transcend, the age of some countries in many respects. And so yes, there's like systems in place that are older than many countries, that those have power, right, through the wealth, through the many things that they have. And so we've got to be careful because there are competing forces of power. And I think that there's a little bit of a dichotomy here where she's talking about, COVID is a mild cold or it's a bioweapon, but also with some of her stuff, it's like, well, you can't just place that on every conspiracy theorist, right? Like these are independent thinkers. And first of all, it's like they do go from it's a mild cold to it's a bioweapon. Well, maybe they've come to understand more information or new disclosed information. And And so that changes the way that they think about the things. And so given that with the things that happened, if maybe they thought it was, oh, it's just like the flu, and then more comes out and it came from a lab, well, maybe it was a bioweapon. Maybe this is a cover up. Maybe it was a bio attack and we would be at war right now if other things hadn't happened. There can be any number of conspiracy theories generated from anything in many respects, but just because you don't agree or you're in one camp or under one banner doesn't mean that you get to group everyone else, right? There's multiple diverse groups of individuals out there with their individual thoughts and their individual patterns of behavior that they are using to get through life with. And we can't just default to the lowest common denominator, even though it's the easy choice. Further on, and I do skip a lot, and I was thinking that maybe one day I will reread this book with more highlights, with more discussion topics, but I just wanted to go through my tabs and my highlights that I had at present, thinking to at least generate some topics of conversation from, because it's a very insightful book. And I think we got to do manufacturing consent next. I've got it around here somewhere right now. And I know this is totally an aside, but I'm going through The Alchemy of Finance again by the man himself, Soros, and re-tabbing it with more tabs and more highlights to do a pretty in-depth discussion. So hopefully that'll be fun. The Unshakable Ethnic Double. I have tabbed really far into the chapter, yet unlike other subject areas where she seems to be mostly bluffing, Naomi Wolf knows her Old Testament and makes a convincing biblical case that Genesis never promised Israel to the Jews exclusively, but it was always conditional on behaving justly, including being kind to strangers. And I think that like the Holy Land is a metaphor. It doesn't have to necessarily be anywhere specific itself, and that you have to behave justly, you have to be good, you have to be a good human, and that transcends many religions. That's just what we should strive for as conscious beings, to elevate ourselves, illuminate, and transcend in many respects. I'm going to skip to the next tab. Takes us to part 4, Facing the Real. Chapter 15 is entitled Unselfing. 3 pages in on this chapter. My first tab is, with online clout too often determining movement leadership and few ways to hold those leaders accountable, conflict and mistrust easily spread. Supercharged by algorithms hooked on rage and egged on by fake accounts and Russian bots that heap salt on all our open wounds. Like, let's not forget that. Like, these Russian bots, they stirred the pot on both sides. So it's always ideal to not feed the trolls online. Now, if you want to be a troll, that's a different story. That's for your own entertainment purposes only. The predatory corporate logics that earlier iterations of the left recognized as our enemies were clearly deep inside us now, in the arteries that connected us, in our habits of mind, in our very selves. It felt like nothing could be trusted, least of all one another. I think she's calling to the forefront something about, it's very interesting. And I'm glad that she points it out, that at somewhere in this book, she points out that, liberals were generally the champions against big corporations. So why is it so weird that they were so easily I don't want to use flight to quality, but they so easily turncoated and championed big pharmaceutical? I guess right, because it had the backing of the government. I don't know. It was just prudent of her to point out, and I respect that. All right. Unselfing. Conspiracy theories, as we have seen, are both symptoms of confusion and powerlessness and tools of division and distraction that benefit elites. Okay, that part is true. The fact that there are fake ones made by the elites to distract us is a very important fact that we all need to operate under when making our own strategic decisions. But conspiracy theories are far from the only things that keep us divided. So at times are the ways we have learned to understand our own victimization. I think that's important. Understanding how the world wants you to be a victim is a very important mentality to have, because the world loves victims, the world loves making victims, and the world loves a victim. And so we need to make sure that that is not something that is perpetuated, because at the end of the day, the victim is the victim, and we want to be the ones that are alive, the ones that are winning. Don't be a victim. Don't be dead. A quote from someone who wrote about the Holocaust. I won't read. My last tab of the book, and far from some of the most insightful things that this book is going to provide you with, highly recommend picking up a copy of this and just anything that Naomi Klein does. She's a phenomenal author, and she raises a lot of good points that a lot of people who I think she might be railing against conspiracy-wise might actually be on her side in many ways. Take those 2 trucker convoys, the noisy one and the quieter one 8 months earlier, which was organized in solidarity with indigenous communities grieving their stolen children. So you are also against the stolen children. right? We've seen the government do it. You're talking about it here. The government stole those children. What makes you think that whatever monetary incentive caused the government in Canada to steal those children that you're very aware of would not be the same system that was taken advantage of by corrupt people in power in the United States, especially at the border? I'm just calling in that, yes, I cannot prove it, but it does make you question things. Who is harvesting? They made such a stark contrast. So one way of seeing the two convoys is that one was good and the other bad. One was progress, the other white lash. That would be a comforting binary to choose between, and in way, that's how I told the story. But here's where the ground starts moving. Some truckers participated in both convoys, and it was solidarity. And I think that's the one of the great closing messages is like, you can be in both. Like, you can be in both convoys. You can be for freedom of autonomy and freedom of self and freedom of body, but also be for like protect the children. And I think that's what we all need to come to understand, is that there is this forever dichotomous battle of yin and yang between who we are, and the world wants to confuse us so that we aren't comfortable with ourselves, so that this division that people who do have the ability to create said division through manufacturing propaganda, Noam Chomsky, right? Manufacturing consent, like prerequisite for a lot of stuff in life these days. And without having that view of being able to pick apart and see, it often can confuse you because the narrative can change so much that it gives you whiplash. And it's almost like, it's almost like we're in a mental asylum of a world, and the world loves a victim. And so the more crazy people, the more you're separated, the more confused, the more scared, the easier you are. And this is something we learned from Sun Tzu in The Art of War, and any of the other ancient military texts that we've been reading on this channel, is that the more confused and stressed and split and disoriented you are, is when you will be attacked. And so these forces that are causing us to be confused with each other, be split with each other, right, create these divisions, this red versus blue, this black versus white, this rich versus poor, everything that we know of, man versus woman, it's all, any kind of anger can be perpetuated because emotions are strong. And because of this, we need to make sure that we're understanding that this can cause even a schism within our own self, within our own soul. And I think that this book, Doppelganger, does a great job of exposing that dichotomy that's becoming more and more apparent to many people. And I think it might even scare some people, and it's even more dangerous for the people who don't understand. And so understanding that everybody is multiplicitous and has many personalities and many emotions and many instances of being is just something that can really bring us into understanding each other even better and moving on into a future that is accommodating to all.